Hello and welcome again to another edition of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. Going to speak to something that I've been trying to work through in the attempt to better help students figure out how to generate their hold. So we've got some heuristics that allow for decision making. So we have contact as control and control as safety. So regardless of what you're going to do, you want to consider the mix of how the table is controlling the patient's movement and how you as a practitioner are controlling the patient's movement. So we have patient positioning heuristics. One being the table makes stable. So the more of the patient that is in contact with the table, the more stable they are. Supine and prone being the most stable. In any position outside of supine and prone, we have to consider the second heuristic, which is less stable means I need to make the patient stable. Okay, so I need to start to think about contact as control. The next heuristic is the space between us is unstable. So again, I need to be as close to the patient as possible so that I can have more contact with them. Then with respect to choosing which position to put them in, I want the anatomy exposed, free to move in plane or planes required, and preferably visible. Preferably visible allows us to think about the heuristic of keep your hands and your eyes on the prize, aka multisensory integration. So the more senses you have directed at your goal, the more appropriately you'll be able to interact with it. Okay, so we've got a bunch of stuff coming together, trying to help people make decisions. Then the other thing that I have definitely come across and is embedded within the educational process, but I'm thinking that I need to be more explicit about, is think about the movement or the end goal as opposed to what you as the practitioner are doing. At a certain point, especially early on, you have to think about what you're doing. Where are you? Where are you putting your hands? Why are you doing it? Absolutely, as a novice, that's going to matter. But if you're thinking more about the goal, a lot of the other things can fall into place. When you're learning something for the first time, as I already noted, or early on in the learning process, a little bit more thinking about yourself and where you're positioned is going to matter. But that's why what we do is provide people the challenge to do the same movement in all positions to the same body region or body area or body structure so that they can start to recognize all of the challenges. If we have somebody do something seated as a practitioner, what we make them do is try to do that from in front of the patient, beside the patient, and behind the patient. Try to get the same movement to occur so that they start to understand the pros and cons of each positional relationship, right? So if you're in lateral, try to work in front, try to work behind. What I will say is that I very quickly encourage students to work from behind the patient in lateral, because then the patient can be closer to them. They don't have to reach as far. They can usually see what they're working on. If you want to work on the patient's back and you stand in front of them, you're going to be really reaching, you're going to be hard on your hamstrings, you're not going to see what's going on, you're probably going to roll the patient towards you when you're working on the things on their posterior surface. Whereas if you stand behind them, you can give yourself visual relief if you happen to be standing, right? You can look down and get a decent view, not a perfect view, but a decent view. If you're sitting down, you can get a relatively decent view because you're going to have a little bit of distance between yourself and the patient, so you can look at what you're working on. So we purposefully have students work through solving the problem of generating, whether it be an active or a passive motion in the patient, in all patient positions, and trying to put yourself in a different spot in relation to the patient in whatever position they happen to be, so that you can start to problem solve through this. All right, now, the reason that I'm talking about focusing more on the outcome motion is because if you are more focused on what you're doing as a practitioner, you're probably paying less attention to what you're doing to the patient. You're paying more attention to where and what you're doing with your hands as opposed to paying attention to what your hands are doing with the outcome of the patient, right? So you should be paying attention to what your hands are. You should be paying attention to what is happening to the patient. Your hands are the main tool to do that with. Your eyes are a large tool. Your ears are also a very important tool for this purpose. So if we consider one of the underpinning concepts of how we've generated the curriculum and the approach It's the optimal theory of motor learning. So it's optimizing motivation and attention for learning. It has 3 subcomponents. So before I talk about the 3 subcomponents, I want to mention this, and this is in older videos, so if you go through the library of Osteopathic Lyceum content, you will find this. Essentially what's happened is there's been a large amount of previous research aggregated, as well as research and experimentation done by the individuals that put this forward. And I may mess up the name. The primary researcher whose name I remember, I believe, is Rebecca Luthwaite. I could be wrong about the name, so please excuse me if I am. But it's the optimal theory of motor learning. It's not terribly hard to find. Essentially what happened is the research group has run experiments, but they've also brought a bunch of previous research together, assayed it, and identified what is very similar with respect to those categories or those constructs that seem to improve motor learning outcomes. You have AS, or autonomy support. So we'll talk about the components. The autonomy support component, the general finding is that you don't want full autonomy in the learning process. You want binded. I'm saying that a little bit funny, but you want autonomy, or the ability to make choice within boundaries. Full free choice for a novice doesn't work particularly well because they have no idea what to do. Too many choices to make, so all choices can be considered challenging or difficult or wrong, right? Whatever. But if you give them minor choices, there's some level of autonomy which helps with engagement. The classic example that I'm aware of, because they use putting tasks, golf putting, for motor learning experiments a lot, is if you give the person the subject the opportunity to choose something like the color of the ball or the color of the putter they're going to use, there actually seems to be a bump in learning performance, or say accuracy, or speed to accuracy, or speed to adjustment, things like that. The next one is EE, or enhanced expectancy. So that's either identifiable success, so they have to know that they succeeded. There can be obscure tasks where it's hard to know that you succeeded, which is why I say you have to know that you succeeded. With motor learning experiments, usually a target is hit or a target is missed. So the experimentation can be more obvious, or the result can be more obvious. Enhanced expectancies can be positive social comparison as well, or positive experiences. Now, those positive experiences could be praise, so you did something good, and somebody acknowledges it, or it could be, regardless of outcome, it seems that if you say nice things to people or positive things, that it has some impact on motor learning performance. I'm not exceptionally sharp with that, but that's the general gist of what I understand as it stands right now. Then you have EF, or external focus of attention. So across a broad spectrum of motor learning experimentation, what they've noted is that if you have an internal focus, or focus on what the subject is doing, where they're placing their hands, what they're doing with their body, it seems to be, say, slower to accuracy or harder time performing motor learning task. Whereas if you have an external focus of attention, hit the target as the simplest example. Just tell them hit the target, or make sure you look to this side, no, that's incorrect. That's a wrong way to say it, but hit the target, right? If you're playing basketball, put the ball through the hoop. End of story. If you have them focus on that as opposed to what do I need to do with my hand, what do I need to do with my hand seems to slow down motor learning. Telling them what to do with the ball or where the ball needs to go seems to some degree, speed up motor learning. So that external focus of attention seems to have a positive outcome. Now, the reason I want to talk about it is I'm thinking about it as a possible place that I can put a little bit more explicit attention to in order to help the learners figure out where to put themselves. It's already baked in. I'm asking them purposely to put themselves in different positions. And early on, they do a really good job of coming up with ways to use good contact to generate the motion, regardless of where they are in relation to the patient and regardless of the patient position. They do a really good job. But it seems like after that, they because I asked them to try to prioritize what the most appropriate way to do that is, or the most beneficial way to do that in any given situation. So I asked them to choose between. And then subsequent to that, it seems that they may not be hanging on to the primary objective as well, because they ask more about their hands than about the outcome. And I think I can maybe do a better job explicitly saying, well, if you're getting the outcome, it's probably pretty good, unless you notice yourself too much. So I think the thing that I want to try to piece between is, how do I figure out a way to tell the practitioner, to tell the student, to tell the learner that if they feel themselves a lot, if they feel themselves straining, to just try something different, right? If you give too many specific details, it's too many details to remember. So I could say, well, go through a checklist, drop your shoulders, make sure your elbows are low, make sure this, that, and the other. And unfortunately, that would raise cognitive load, which we're trying to avoid. So I'm trying to figure out a consistent, slick way that will work more often than not to say or suggest that if you feel yourself as the practitioner too much, or you feel some strain, that how you're doing this could probably be made better. And then I have to rely on the search process that the students have already shown that they're good at, but I would probably have to lean into supporting them doing that as opposed to giving them more details. Now, the reason that we want them to search for the solution as best they can with feedback, not absent feedback, but with feedback, is because there will be times when they'll be completely on their own. And to be fair, the vast majority of their practice life will be on their own with no feedback other than themselves. So trying to give them as much support to solve problems when they're really stuck, but then lean into the fact that they've solved the problem before, becomes very important. So this also then relates to some other motor learning information that I'm taking in that I'm not exceptionally sharp with, but there's a term called the ecological approach, and I think it's non-linear problem solving, or non-linear practice, I think is maybe more accurate. You have the classic instructional method in many athletic fields of step-by-step procedural coaching, and in contrast, some people would claim is the ecological approach, or non-linear practice. So instead of isolating a skill and then putting it back in right away, that's wrong. Isolating a skill and practicing it for a long period of time and then putting it into gameplay. What they're doing is they're introducing a skill and trying to put it into gameplay as quickly as possible, I think. I think it would look different in many different athletic situations or motor learning situations. So again, my sharpness, my understanding, my acuity with that concept is currently not great, and I want to say that. But it does seem to line up well with the process that I explicitly state, which is discovery learning followed by guided learning. So, okay, what do I want you to do? I want you to generate cervical rotation, patient passive in seated, supine, prone, and lateral. Go ahead. And in all positions, try to do it in as many orientations towards the patient as possible. So explicitly in seated, I want you to try to get cervical rotation when you're in front of the patient, beside the patient, and behind the patient. In supine, I could ask for the head of the table, and I can ask for beside the patient. I can't ask for down table because reaching too far and it gets kind of creepy. In lateral, I can ask for you to be in front of the patient, behind the patient, and at the head of the table. In prone, becomes much tougher, but I can explicitly ask for these things and then attempt to call to memory that process, how it felt, how it went, because what you're trying to do is give them the challenge to discover how to do it, struggle with it so that they have the embodied experience of the struggle, and then provide feedback along the way, as well as idealized methods that will work more often than not. So the demonstration of idealized methods is the guided learning, right? Or as they're solving the problem, as they're going through the discovery, the feedback process is also guided learning. That seems to line up well with that non-linear practice, trying to provide discovery opportunities so that they learn how to find paths that work, so that they learn what it's like to path find or problem solve. Because the details will change. The way that I would describe treating a neck is not the way that you would treat every neck. The way that I would describe treating a shoulder is not the way you would treat every shoulder. So there's definitely been times in the teaching process where I've said explicitly, because I'm trying to work this out, that the search is more important than the move, right? So the ability to search for what works is more important than any of the moves themselves or any of the techniques themselves. But there are overarching concepts that are hierarchical, right? The barrier concept is always there. Don't make them say ouch. Don't move in a way that makes them protect themselves. That's always there. That is the highlight of osteopathy, whether people like to buy that, like to say that or not. That's osteopathy. The barrier concept, don't make them say ouch. That's it. That's the single distinguishing feature between osteopathy and other hands-on professions. So the search is more important than the move. The search is more important than the move. I keep saying that. But now upon looking at how that message is landing and translating into the types of questions that I receive in instructional settings, it's giving me the opportunity to reflect and say, okay, maybe I need to focus a little bit more on ensuring that when I say the search, I remind them that the movement they're trying to create generally is very important, as well as how the tissues respond, which is guided by the barrier concept. So if a tissue responds by tightening up in relation to your movement, then you're doing it wrong. If you can move them to a point slightly before it grabs, and work on that with a variety of activating approaches. So this is where we talk about PTB, patient activity. So the patient is active or passive. The T is the tissue or tissues targeted. The answer is always the tissues that don't move. The B is the barrier, AKA don't make them say ouch. If they protect themselves, right, don't go direct. If you go direct and they don't protect themselves, you can go direct. If they do say ouch or they do protect themselves, then the answer is make the soft tissue soft. Right? That's the indirect approach. So we've got these hierarchy of things that I think I need to be more consistently explicit about. And in doing something like this, having this conversation towards a camera that will go out to the world, it records the process and what the process looks like outside. So there's some degree to which, if you have the time and you care, you can track how this goes. You can track the evolution of something. So the ground substrate, the bedrock of the approach is sound. It's producing good results, but you're always looking for ways to try to get it to be better, with the acknowledgement that the specific talk track or the specific words will not work for everybody. Right? So you're trying to tune into each individual to the best of your ability. You need a really good starting point. You need really good bedrock. And then from there, you can interact with each person as they display the need. So I heard a concept from a track and field coach, from a sprint coach. He does a lot of rehab and works with a lot of professional teams. His name is Derek Hansen. I've never met Derek, but I know somebody that Derek did a lot of work with, or I knew somebody in Charlie Francis, who is a very influential coach, very influential sprint coach. Some people have negative feelings, some people have positive feelings. If you look Charlie up, you'll figure that out. But Derek was talking about, if you look at training groups, if you look at sprint training groups, there will always be one athlete that is heavily outperforming the vast majority of the rest of the athletes. And the concept is that the particular athlete that is outperforming everybody else is responding to the treatment, or the training approach, right? It's the proper fit for them, whereas everybody else is not responding as well. It's because it's not the proper fit for those people. When you have a large training group, it's actually hard to make one training approach that will work for each individual. So you're sort of going down the middle, or going down what you think should work. And then maybe you have time to adjust for each individual, maybe you don't, it depends. Same phenomena plays on any level in any approach to something. When you're trying to get an outcome, is you'll have to do it a little bit different. I would assume, and this is partially informed by conversations that I've had with people who have worked on inanimate objects, so on things like cars, that even though it's the same vehicle, the same model, the same motor, the actual process, the details of the process of doing the same job will vary a bit. because of things like different use patterns, maybe manufactured on a different day. There's going to be these tiny differences. They're not going to be gigantically meaningful, but you have to tune into them to get the job done. Same with osteopathy. Each person is different. So you can't have one move. You have to be able to generate the move that will work for that person in that moment between you and that person. So the way that I would generate that move is not the same as the way that another practitioner would generate the move. So we've got some gray area there, which is why it seems that priming for far transfer using a discovery followed by guided learning approach, which lines up relatively well in the motor learning literature with what I think is the nonlinear practice, the ecological approach, right? Because it's based on the problem solving to develop the skills that are necessary to tune into any given situation, the ability to adjust, the ability to alter what you're doing. So that then comes out in me previously in the search is more important than the move, but I need to make that more tangible to some degree or hang that on some other things that are more obvious decision-making points, such as, the barrier concept, contact as control, right? How do you choose the position? So go back into leaning on those decision points that are a little bit more clear than instead of saying the search. The term the search is more important than the move is probably too abstract and doesn't allow for decisions. It's like, okay, I am searching, but nothing's happening. Okay, well, how do you search? Okay, well, let's figure out first what the goal movement is, and then how are they responding to going direct or indirect? So the B in PTB, right? So just go back to PTB as something that maybe I should talk about more explicitly more often. So going through that, seeing how the same phenomenons play out in different research literatures with respect to learning approaches. So one's motor learning and one's more cognitive learning. So the more cognitive learning, we'll say discovery followed by guided, where it seems as though in motor learning at the moment, the discussion is non-linear practice. And hopefully I'm saying the right pre, it's not P, it's not non-linear problem solving. Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. Again, admittedly less sharp there, but I can see the similarity in phenomenon. So it's probably the same phenomenon that is underpinning the benefits of that approach. So the non-linear practice is probably the same phenomenon as discovery followed by guided learning. Right? The guided learning could be the feedback during the attempt to solve whatever problem is presented. So seeing these things come together, talking through it, allowing myself the reflection point to say, okay, how do I get more explicit about telling these people what to do? Focus on the movement and then think PTB, right? Is the patient active or passive? Which tissues are you targeting? Answer is always the ones that don't move, so you've already found those because you assessed it. And then B, the barrier concept. So if they say ouch, go indirect. If they don't say ouch, you can go direct, but make sure that they're not protecting themselves, so no grabs. So I think I can make it more explicit with things that are already there. So we've got a really good framework, really good bedrock. We build on top of it, and then I adjust over time based on the feedback that I get from observing the process in others. The results are great so far. I would just like to ensure that I can make them better, and then have touch points like these for anybody who would go back and investigate what this process looks like. It's one of the reasons I'm doing the vlog content. Okay, well, what do you actually have to do day to day if you're running any form of educational institution? Now, if it's big enough, what you do is you subdivide all the little jobs. But if you're small, such as what I'm aiming to be and stay, is, well, I've got to do most of the work. So what is that actual activity, right? Things in my head, I got to buy garbage bags. I might even need to buy garbage cans. I definitely have enough garbage cans, but I might need to buy bigger ones just because of general volume. I do need to get toilet paper, right? So trying to reflect on these processes, have some record of it, and in producing the record of it, anybody who listens as far as you have right now has the opportunity to learn something from it. So thank you for listening, and we'll talk again soon.